This is Right from the Deep.
I'm Karen Ball.
And I'm Erin Taylor Young. And this is the podcast from writers for writers, answering the question,
why am I doing this?
Right. As writers, editors,
and a former literary agent,
we're in the deep with you,
encouraging you and equipping you to find your truest story in the deep places.
Get our show notes and more, including a free audio download on how to safeguard your writer's heart at rightfromthedeep.com.
Hey guys, here's what's happening at Right from the Deep.
Well, first, thank you to all our patrons on Patreon. You guys, we're thankful for you. You help make this podcast possible. And if anyone else out there wants to add their support, you can visit Patreon. That's patreon.com/rightfromthedeep. We'd appreciate it.
A big thank you to our July sponsor of the month, Wendy L. MacDonald. She's a writer, poet, podcaster, photographer, a maker of journals. You can find her on Etsy to see them, and a nature lover. I know you'd enjoy getting to know her. Check out the treasury of her website at wendylmacdonald, MacDonald.com.
Yes, thank you, Wendy. And I am delighted to say I'll be at the Florida Christian Writers Conference. That's coming up, guys. It's July and going to be October soon. And that's in Leesburg, Florida, October 16th through 20th. And there will be a link in the show notes. I hope to see you guys there.
So it's my turn for the wonder, and I find that really frustrating because this has been a wonderless month for me ever since April 23rd when we had a flood in our house in the guest bathroom, and working with insurance and contractors and trying to deal with things. And our house is torn up. All the furniture is in storage, and they're going to be replacing all the floors, and we're going to be paying a lot of money out of pocket because insurance is being a pain in the neck.
Oh.
The wonder in all of this for me is that God still loves me, even when I get frustrated, even when I want to hit something. He understands those emotions. He knows where I'm at, and he has patience with me, even if I don't deserve it. And so I'm grateful to him for that.
Yes, we all go through that, don't we?
Yep.
And now, here's the show. Welcome, listeners. We are glad that you are joining us here in the deep. So, this year, we've been talking about various practices for deepening our relationship with God, and we're going to link to some of those other episodes in the show notes. Today, we want to cover a practice that isn't the first choice, okay? Not the first choice for most of us because, well, it's not very comfortable, and often we just put it off or don't do it. So what is this practice? It is fasting.
Okay, now hang in there with us, because while fasting typically involves abstaining from food for a period of time, we're well aware that some of you, myself included, have medical issues that make it unsafe, even life-threatening, to skip meals. So in this episode, we'll also cover alternatives to traditional fasting.
Yes. So first, let's talk about why fasting matters. I mean, like, who thought of this and why? Well, I will sum up my research findings. I couldn't find any source that claimed to know exactly when this practice started. New World Encyclopedia just says, quote, fasting for religious and spiritual reasons has been part of human custom since prehistory, unquote. Okay. But, and by that they mean before written records, but it's also found in ancient written records, including the text of the New Testament and the Old Testament.
So how often is fasting mentioned in the Bible? An article on cslewisinstitute.org lists many occasions. In Deuteronomy chapter 9, Moses recounts how he did not one but two 40-day fasts when he was meeting with God on Mount Sinai after leading the Israelites out of Egypt. In Daniel 10:3, in response to an overwhelming, terrifying vision, Daniel talks about his partial fast for 21 days and says, I ate no delicacies, no meat or wine entered my mouth, nor did I anoint myself at all for the full 3 weeks. And after this, he received the meaning of the vision.
And here's what it says in Ezra chapter 8, verses 21 through 23. And this is when Ezra is leading a group of exiles from Babylon back to Jerusalem. This is what it says. Then I proclaimed a fast there at the river Ahava, that we might humble ourselves before our God to seek from him a safe journey for ourselves, our children, and all our goods. For I was ashamed to ask the king for a band of soldiers and horsemen to protect us against the enemy on our way, since we had told the king, the hand of our God is for good on all who seek him, and the power of his wrath is against all who forsake him. So we fasted and implored our God for this, and he listened to our entreaty.
In the book of Esther, when Haman succeeded in getting a law published to kill all the Jews, the rat fink, Esther was going to go to the king to plead for mercy. But appearing before him without being summoned was punishable by death unless the king held out his scepter to her. So here's what she tells her uncle Mordecai. Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish.
And there's another fast during a national emergency, and that happens in the time of King Jehoshaphat. This giant army combined of different people groups has come against him, and this is the king's response in 2 Chronicles 20:3-4. Then Jehoshaphat was afraid and set his face to seek the Lord and proclaimed a fast throughout all Judah. And Judah assembled to seek help from the Lord. From all the cities of Judah, they came to seek the Lord. And you guys want to know what the result of this fast was? God delivered them. They didn't even need to fight the battle because the opposing armies, they basically just killed each other off.
Fasting is found in the New Testament as well. Mark chapter 1 tells us Jesus himself fasted in the wilderness for 40 days. And Jesus' teaching on fasting in Matthew chapters 6 and 9 make it clear that he expects this to be a normal practice for his followers after his crucifixion. In Acts chapter 9, Saul, later to be called the Apostle Paul, fasts for 3 days after being blinded after his vision of Jesus on the road to Damascus.
And in Acts 13, God's instructions to launch the first missionary journey come during the course of prayer and fasting. And then Paul and Barnabas are set off and with another round of prayer and fasting. And it's clear that fasting was a regular part of their journey. Acts 14:23 says, "And when Paul and Barnabas had appointed elders for them in every church, with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed."
Now, we won't take the time to give detailed examples of prominent fasting Christians in the centuries after the Bible was written, but it's good to point out that John Calvin, Martin Luther, Jonathan Edwards, John Wesley, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and C.S. Lewis were all enthusiastic supporters and practitioners of fasting.
One more thing we should make clear, the article that we mentioned earlier in cslewisinstitute.org, it states that the Bible specifically defines fasting as going without food. Here's how they put it. Quote, in the Old Testament, the main Hebrew word is tzom, which means to abstain from food. In the New Testament, the Greek word we translate as fast is nesteo, which means to abstain from eating. In both testaments, fasting is simply going without food in order to seek God for some special reason, unquote.
And the reason they stress this definition is because this is what the actual practice was and is, going without food. This is what the Israelites did. It's what Jesus did, and it's what he's teaching about. So if your health allows, this is the normal way to practice fasting. But again, we know not everyone can physically do this, so we'll also discuss alternatives. First, though, let's circle back to the purpose of this practice. The article on cslewisinstitute.org says it's to, quote, seek God for some special reason, unquote. So why would fasting help us do that?
Yes, indeed. Let's talk about that. The first reason why is fasting helps us divorce ourselves from the ordinary pleasures and occupations of this world. Dallas Willard, in his book, The Spirit of the Disciplines, and we've talked about this book before, and we'll probably talk about it again, and we'll link to it in the show notes. We've He writes this, though, about fasting. Fasting teaches us a lot about ourselves very quickly. It reveals to us how much our peace depends on the pleasures of eating, unquote. And Justin Whitmell Early, in his book, The Common Rule, adds this, quote, fasting is a way to resist the original sin of trying to eat our way to happiness, unquote.
Early goes on to describe how he feels during a day of fasting. He says, quote, it's mid-morning when I become irritable. Not only am I trying to concentrate over a hungry stomach, but I also can't do what I otherwise do every day. Look forward to lunch or snacks as a way to medicate the pain of toilsome work. He continues describing the discomfort of his day, then he sums it all up with this, quote, when I fast, I see that deep down, I'm not actually a very patient person after all. I'm not actually a very content person after all. I'm a weak, impatient, angry person who medicates with food and drink. This is painful to confront, yet to live without fasting is to live without knowing who I truly am, unquote.
Now, guys, knowing our weaknesses is humbling, right? But that's right where we need to be in order to effectively seek God, which leads us to our second reason fasting helps us seek God. Fasting reminds us that we are humbly dependent on God. And that's for everything, okay? Acts 17:25 tells us God is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else.
It's simple. God supplies our daily bread, our clothes, our homes, our jobs, our stories, our words, our talents, and so on and so on and so on. Everything comes from him. Dallas Willard writes, quote, persons well used to fasting as a systematic practice will have a clear and constant sense of their resources in God, unquote. And that's exactly what we need as Christians, a better connection to the reality of God as our constant provider. But there's more. Willard goes on to say that this connection and constant sense developed through the systematic practice of fasting, and it will help us, quote, endure deprivations of all kinds, even to the point of coping with them easily and cheerfully, unquote. Yeah, coping with deprivation easily and cheerfully. That's quite the promise.
It is. And now imagine what coping tearfully and easily with deprivations could look like. If, say, maybe you found you have to type your next book with one hand because you've developed carpal tunnel syndrome in the other. Or if you thought the time that you had, that suddenly gets cut in half because some unforeseen family emergency. Or if you lose your publishing contract or your day job, or you have to tighten your belt due to the crazy inflation these days, or whatever else. Imagine guys coping with that cheerfully and easily because you're used to deprivations.
But the third reason that fasting helps us is it helps us to feast on God. God is more than just the giver of stuff we need. Dallas Willard writes, quote, fasting confirms our utter dependence on God by finding in him a source of sustenance beyond food. In fasting, we learn how to suffer happily as we feast on God, unquote. So, fasting helps us see God as more than a provider of resources, but actually as sustenance itself. Listen to Deuteronomy 8:3, where Moses speaks to the Israelites before they head into the promised land. Quote, God humbled you, causing you to hunger and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord, unquote.
And now fast forward to the New Testament and listen to what Jesus says about this bread of God in John 6, verses 33 and 51. Quote, for the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh, unquote. So guys, fasting helps us see God by seeking to feast on him, on who he is and on what he's done and what he will keep doing throughout eternity.
Now, listen to what Psalm 36, 7-9 says, quote, the children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. They feast on the abundance of your house, and you give them drink from the river of your delights. For with you is the fountain of life. In your light do we see light, unquote. So not only can we feast on God, we can also feast on doing God's will. In John chapter 4, Jesus is talking to the woman at the well in Samaria while his disciples have gone to the village to buy food. When they come back, they urge him to eat. And here's what he says, quote, I have food to eat that you do not know about, unquote. So the disciples are trying to figure out if someone brought him food while they were gone, but then Jesus goes on in chapter 34, quote, Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work, unquote.
And I love how Dallas Willard sums this up. When we fast, he writes, we learn that we too have meat to eat that the world does not know about. Fasting unto our Lord is therefore feasting, feasting on him and on doing his will. Now, guys, none of that means we don't actually experience the discomfort of hunger, because we do. We typically do. But one way those hunger pangs can help us seek God is by being a constant reminder to pray. As we go about the busyness of our life, the habit of praying, that can sometimes be something that's just superficially brief, or we put it off until we have more time, or we just forget. But prayer is the key in communicating with God. So the reminder to pray that hunger brings to us can help us foster more constant interaction with God.
Well, and hey, there is some good news. If you're fasting, you don't have to spend time making dinner and eating it. And well, you've just freed up more time to spend with God. How cool is that? Another benefit of the discomfort of fasting is that it can help us tune into the needs of others. Here's what Justin Whitmell Early writes of his own experience returning home from a day at work when he's been fasting. Quote, I come home at dinner time not expecting to eat. I'm simply expecting to serve other people as they eat. The most remarkable part is that I'm actually happier that way because all along I've been thinking that food makes me happy. But now I see that only love does that. When that switch happens, ironically, one of my favorite things to do is cook for other people when I'm fasting.
I love that. Now, I'm sure you all out there are going to find other benefits to fasting that we didn't have time to cover. But one last benefit that we do want to mention is that fasting gives us empathy with those who are suffering. And that in turn expands our capacity and our tenacity in our prayers for the needs of those around us.
Justin Whitmell Early again writes, when we fast, we become more attuned to the stubborn reality of the world's suffering. While there is a part of fasting that reveals our own needs, there is a part that reveals the world's needs too. Fasting is a way to lean past our own emptiness into someone else's. It's a practice of empathy, of willingly walking into pain for someone else. It's an imitation of Christ.
I love that. So now, guys, you've been so patient. For those of you who can't fast, either for physical or mental health reasons, remember the goal here as you're looking for a suitable alternative. As Justin Whitmell Early puts it, you want to lean into the lack. So one idea that, might mean leaning into the lack here is instead of not eating, maybe you change to eat very simple meals. You can follow what Daniel did, and rather than abstain from all foods, you can choose to abstain from certain foods, maybe especially those we consume for pleasure, more so than healthy sustenance. We need protein every day, right? But does it need to come from whatever your favorite source of protein is? Maybe not. What about things like soda or refined sugar or chocolate or potato chips? Or, these are the things that we like the taste of, and we eat them for pleasure rather than for nutritional value.
In his book, The Spirit of the Disciplines, Dallas Willard writes, quote, the desert fathers, such as St. Anthony, often subsided for long periods of time on bread and water, unquote. But he also cautions that their bread was much more substantial than what we have today. So you might not want to eat just store-bought white bread.
Right.
But what is the simplest meal that can supply the basic nutrients you need? The goal is to experience discomfort, to be humbled, and to focus on God as our fullness.
Another alternative, and something that can also be done in conjunction with simple meals, is to not eat between meals if your medical condition makes that doable for you. I know personally, I have the habit of grazing. My watch tells me it's time to stand. That's great. I stand up, but then what I do? I walk to the kitchen and have a little snack. That's probably not the thought that Apple had in mind when they thought of the stand thing. So when I analyze that, yeah, it's probably counterproductive. But for the most part, here's the thing. I don't need those snacks. I just like them.
Kelly Minter, in her Bible study, Encountering God, Cultivating Habits of Faith Through the Spiritual Disciplines, writes this, quote, when we fast, we're practicing the needed discipline of saying no to ourselves and yes to God, unquote. So for alternatives to fasting from food, what other things can we say no to? Well, we can abstain from entertainment. No TV, no phone games, no social media, scrolling for birds and puppies and other fun videos.
Yes.
No Spotify, Pandora, or podcasts. No reading, except, of course, ours. No reading for pleasure, going to the movies, sporting events, or whatever you do for fun. Take a whole day off, and rather than seeking distraction, seek only God, His presence, His words, His direction. Learn to delight in God and only God.
Or, guys, we can abstain from something else. What are the things in your life that take up time, things that you look forward to and would miss and would help you cultivate and lean into a lack? Suppose you're an extroverted person and you hate to be alone and you spend lots of time getting together with friends. Well, maybe one night you choose to stay home and have a date with God.
Or maybe you like to go out and shop. You don't even necessarily need to buy things, or you may not buy things, although maybe sometimes you do. But instead of hitting the mall to look around and see what's new, you abstain for 40 days. Instead, you use that time to stay home and seek God.
There's probably lots of other alternatives out there that, we haven't thought of, or you guys can think of it. If you want to give it personalized time and thought, ask God to show you. The point is to practice fasting in whatever way your health allows and incorporate this into your spiritual life. As Dallas Willard writes, fasting is one of the more important ways of practicing that self-denial required of everyone who would follow Christ.
So, Kelly Minter sums up her reasoning for fasting this way in her Bible study, Encountering God. Quote, I believe we can and should fast for guidance, healing, direction, intercession, in pursuit of spiritual breakthroughs and more. But I believe one of the greatest reasons we can fast is simply in pursuit of a deeper experience with Christ, unquote. And that, my friends, is what it's really all about.
Amen.
Amen.
Thanks for joining us today. You can find previous episodes and more resources at rightfromthedeep.com.
And I bet you know someone who needs this podcast, so please share it with them.
So until next time,
embrace the deep.
Your writing and your life will never be the same.